they show that the same neural network can be trained to perform a whole bunch of different video games at or above human levels, with a few games in which they performed worse than human levels. And that's super impressive. And there's a lot of advances that have happened in that field since then. At the time, the neural networks that were trained on each of these different games, it was the same network that could do all of them. But on the other hand, the networks had to be retrained from scratch every time they played a different game. So that's already sort of a little bit of a hint as to what we would want an artificial general intelligence mechanism, or something that would resemble what humans and other biological agents can do, is not to necessarily suffer interference between playing multiple games, but to learn which elements of games are common across the games and to transfer. And as one example of that, this is on the left is going to be a video of a neural network that was trained on this game called Breakout, where it has to use its paddle to break these little blocks. And you could see the performance of the network after it's trained looks like what you would expect from a human playing the game. It's moving around and it's hitting the blocks, and it does just fine. But another group wanted to demonstrate the brittleness of these algorithms by showing that if you just take the trained network and all you do is shift the paddle up by 1 pixel, now the game completely fails. So it's just a single pixel is showing a failure to transfer, and that's not the kind of thing that you would expect to see in a biological agent. Now, I'm not trying to really pick on the field of deep neural networks. They're trying to solve some problems that are really high dimensional, and they have done amazing things actually in terms of in lots of disciplines. But what I am going to argue is that we should try to understand sort of in a more almost like a toy problem setting, understand the components that would require a general intelligence system to be able to transfer. And the hypothesis that we're working with is that the human brain, which does not show this kind of deficit in transferring, is wired in a particular way with certain architectures and inductive biases that is trying to search for what we call latent and generalizable structure. Hopefully some of that will be more clear as I go through the talk. And I have this whole other sort of setup for this talk that I'm not going to go through, which is that if you look at babies, they are actually quite inefficient in learning a lot of new problems. And we think that the architecture that is sort of wired to try to discover latent generalizable structure is quite inefficient relative to an architecture that's just trying to maximize reward, just trying to do as good as it can. But that same architecture that's inefficient early on is more effective for transfer. And so that will be the general theme of the talk. And so I'm going to focus the talk on this sort of collection of experiments and models that we've done, and talk about them in terms of the application to music, because I like music and I think it's a good example. But in all these examples, you should probably hold in mind that I'm not building a model of a musician. This is just an example that should apply to lots of other domains of skill learning, including, I think, language and other kinds of skills. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the idea that if you're a guitarist and you're learning to play a guitar, you should learn that not only are the mappings, the sort of finger picking that you need to play a particular song, not only does it work on one guitar, but it might work on many other guitars, and they may look different. They may have different, all sorts of differences, but you can learn that there are sort of different contexts that all point to the same set of rules for playing the guitar, and perhaps there are other contexts that require playing a different set of notes. For example, if the tuning is different or it's a different kind of stringed instrument. And so one of the questions there is, how do you learn how to transfer amongst contexts that point to the same set of underlying rules? And then after I discussed that, I wanted to go on to talking about the need for compositionality in these kind of structured learning settings, in the sense that if you learn to play a guitar and then you learn to play a piano, hopefully you're able to transfer some aspects of what you knew on a guitar to a piano. For example, the kinds of notes or songs that you want to play, even though the way in which you play it might be different, and I'll motivate the need for representing things compositionally in model-based reinforcement learning in order to achieve that kind of transfer. And then finally, I'll talk about abstractions in the sense that if you're learning on a high dimensional, you're learning, let's say, on a fretboard, and you're learning there's lots of different strings and different notes that you can play on a fretboard. How do you learn to abstract over those and to decide that many of them mean the same thing in some abstract sense? For example, all these different locations on a fretboard of a guitar, these are different strings and different frets, they all indicate the note C. And the question is, how do you learn and internalize an abstraction that then allows you to transfer to learning entirely different songs that have different, different desired goals and different transitions between the notes? And so for the first half, I'll talk about how we think that the ability to do this kind of structure learning depends on hierarchical corticostriatal circuits. And so here's a schematic for that. It's thought that there are multiple circuits that link frontal cortex with parts of the basal ganglia through the thalamus. And often these are sort of arranged in a hierarchically nested way. For example, from my colleague, David Better has done a lot of work on this. And so let's say you're in a situation where you go into a new cafe in a new city in Europe, and it looks kind of trendy and fun. And you have to decide what are the goals that you want to select. Perhaps you might say, well, given what it looks like, the people that are there and the smells that I have, I'm going to make a decision between some sort of generic coffee or some sort of specialized kind of coffee that I want to choose. And that would be some kind of sub-goal. And then you have to contextualize that decision in order to decide how to move, like how to reach for the coffee and take a sip and decide whether you like it. But if the context is different, if you're a musician that's playing in that cafe, you may also want to use that same context to decide, which guitar to play or which kind of song to play. And when you get reinforcement, when something good happens, you have to know, using this hierarchical system, where to assign the credit. So for example, in the coffee example, if I take a sip and the coffee is delicious, but I happen to reach for the coffee in a sort of odd way, I wouldn't necessarily want to take that delicious reward that I get, the reward that I get for how tasty it was, and reinforce the motor mapping that I just happen to use to reach for the coffee. I may actually want to reinforce the right level of the hierarchy, the decision that in this cafe, it's a good thing to order a specialized coffee. And so that's meant to illustrate the notion that the mapping of stimuli to actions is contextualized, right? So whether you're deciding to play guitar or whether you're deciding to reach for a coffee. And Anne Collins formalized that when she was a postdoc in my lab to map, just to say that there's a whole set of stimuli that map to actions that could be cued by different contexts. And in some cognitive psychology experiment, instead of guitars or coffee or whatever, you can just think about it as mappings of, for example, shapes, S1, S2, S3 might get linked to different actions that you have to learn through trial and error, and you get feedback to learn that, when you see S1, you should press A1 or something like that. And that whole set of mappings could be cued by a context, in this case, a color, C. By convenience, I'm just using C to indicate context, but for the examples that I'll give, they'll also be colors for now, just because it makes it simple. They both stand for C. And so you can just write that in more compact form. And then the idea is that when you go to a different context, there may be a whole entirely different set of mappings between what states you're in and what actions you should take. The example given before in the coffee shop. And there's a whole set of them. And so instead of thinking about it as the individual context should be directly linked to states and actions, perhaps we want to think about them in a more abstract way where the contexts are just pointers to something that we call a task set. And the task set then defines the state action association. And the issue here is that the task set space is latent. So all we observe in the real world are the contexts, like we're in Cafe 1 and Cafe 2 or Guitar 1 and Guitar 2. But what we want to learn is what are the abstract ways in which we can share information between those contexts. And so this is just a point that in the guitar example, these would be different guitars. And the S to A would be like, what notes you want to play, which actions you should play to produce particular outcomes. And so then the question becomes, if you visit a new context that you've never been in before, going back, the question is, what do you do there? You can take a guess and you could say, maybe I should just choose a task set. I should take actions that are consistent in specific states that are consistent with a task set I've seen before. And perhaps I should just try the one that's been the most popular across the context that I've seen in the past. So this is explicitly not the one necessarily that is the most frequent, but it's the one that has the most other contexts that have been associated with it. Or maybe you would try another one that you've learned that's a little bit less popular, but it is valid. It's like a different set of guitars with different tunings. And to formalize that, we use something that's called the Chinese restaurant process, which simply just says that your chance of trying in a new context one of your previous task sets is going to be proportional to the number of previous contexts that have been associated with that task set. And you also have to give the possibility that maybe you need to create a new one from scratch because perhaps you shouldn't transfer. And so there's also that possibility, and that's there's a parameter that decides how likely it is that you be allowed to sort of create a new task set altogether. And this provides sort of a parsimony bias so that it doesn't make you, learn a whole set of new set of task sets everywhere you go for every different context. It tries to encourage the system to reuse those task sets that have been popular in the past. And to the extent that that's useful, you can sort of transfer across them. And that's what I'll try to motivate. But still, the task set space is latent. Like I said, you don't get any indication directly in the world that you're in one task set or another. You just get the context, and you have to make some inferences based on the similarity in the stimulus action space. And there's also unknown size, right? You have the possibility of continually adding new ones. And so with Ann Collins, we built hierarchical neural network models.
Sorry, is it okay to
suggest that you can? Yep.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I just wanted to ask, is there a difference between the task set formalism that you introduced and the option formalism? So is a task set a special case of an option?
A task set is a special case of an option. Yeah. In this case, we're starting off in a really simple setting where the task set is just in a bandit context, right? Where you just take an action and you get an outcome and you decide what is the right set of state action associations. But yes, indeed, it can be generalized to the options setting. And there are some differences in the case of how do you sort of contextually transfer. The option setting isn't, at least in its generic form, isn't really set up to reuse options in other contexts. But yeah, there are ways of connecting it. And in fact, Ann Collins has a paper on that.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so if you think about how it might be implemented in a neural circuit, the idea is that on the right here, this is sort of a cartoon of a generic neural circuit linking the basal ganglia, which is known to be involved in some aspects of reinforcement learning for selecting actions, and the premotor cortex or the motor cortex representing different possible motor actions. And then there's a higher level loop that looks very similar in terms of the sort of anatomical structure. But here, the idea is that you're learning to select higher level sets of actions, which are just entire task set representations in the prefrontal cortex. And the decision of which of those to select depends on the context and is modulated by a sort of a gating process from the basal ganglia. And in these neural networks, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are populations of neurons in these prefrontal circuits that initially don't mean anything. They're not hard-coded to represent a task set. They're just populations of neurons. But to the extent that they get reused, they then conditionalize how the lower level circuit selects its motor responses in response to the state and its inferred task set. And then those neurons come to represent task set kinds of things. And the idea is that you go through reinforcement learning where you get positive and negative reward prediction errors, both at the motor level and at the higher level circuit. And you could try to solve that credit assignment problem that tries to reinforce which action to select and which task set to select. I'm going to actually skip what's on the right side here. And just to point out that these are actually implemented in more detailed neural circuit models of the basal ganglia and frontal cortex, but the details of it don't matter so much for here. And can't resist just sort of making a connection to another line of work that we've been working on that I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But the idea is that this sort of hierarchical nested circuit poses a credit assignment problem, right? So if you get, for example, if you get a negative outcome, how do you know if it's because you selected the wrong motor action for the correct task set or the wrong task set? And so with Arif Hamid, who was a postdoc in the lab with Chris Moore and with myself, he has shown recently that dopamine signals, reward prediction error-like signals in the striatum, are not sort of generic across the whole basal ganglia, but rather they get directed in a sort of traveling wave-like fashion in a way that we showed in this paper seems to support credit assignment to the corresponding circuit. So that's mostly a teaser, because to really establish that, you have to give a whole talk on that. But if you're interested in it, refer to this paper. Okay, so back to the task structure learning. How do we sort of quantify that? So I'm going to start off with this sort of super simple set of mappings, and you'll see that it's really a toy problem for setting up the question and understanding how transfer might work. So people are going to learn this task, and also our models are going to learn this task, where they have to learn that for any individual context, or in this case, color, there may be different states or different stimuli. In this case, they're shapes. And the A's indicate which actions are correct, which ones are rewarded in response to the combination of a given color and shape. And so we set it up so that in this particular experiment, there are two different colors that they're not similar to each other, but they happen to have the same set of rules for how you should respond to different shapes. And then there's another color where you have to learn a different set of mappings. So of course, a basic reinforcement learning agent could just represent each of these dimensions as a conjunctive state and learn what actions to select. But if it did that, it wouldn't sort of notice that there's similarities between these two things. But really, these are just super simple, just state action associations for 6 different mappings. And so you can think of that as like they're, two different guitars, C0 and C1, that look different, but they have the same tuning, same sort of finger picking that you have to do to produce particular notes. And C2 would be a different guitar with a different kind of tuning. And so to really test whether people are learning this, to transfer this knowledge, after they've learned these mappings, we then start introducing new shapes, but in the previous colors. And the actions that they have to learn are different, right? They're new, or sometimes they could be new actions altogether, but there's no way the subject could know at the beginning what action to take because they're new shapes. But the point is that we retain the equivalent structure between C0 and C1. And so if they notice during phase 1, during the initial learning, that there's some similarity between C0 and C1, they will immediately be able to transfer that in this phase, where when they learn S3 goes with A1 for this context, the very first time they see S3 and C1, they should know that's the right action, and vice versa. If they learn at A4 for S4 and C1, the very first time they see it in C0, they should know that. And so that's like saying that there are new notes to learn on the guitar, but it has the same tuning as before. And it's important to note that even for this very simple mapping, if you train a standard deep neural network with backpropagation and so forth in a generic way, of course, it can learn the task, but it doesn't show transfer in this situation. It doesn't really know that there's this latent thing in which C0 and C1 point to the same structure, and then it doesn't actually show that transfer. We also want to ask, do people generalize these learned rules to new contexts altogether? So after they go through this transfer phase, we can then start adding in also new contexts and new colors. And then we set it up such that, one of the task sets is an old one that they've seen before, and one of them is new. And then we can ask, do they tend to reuse task sets that they've seen before? Okay, so for the first transfer phase, it looks like this. They've learned, let's say, these 2 different colors. And we were saying that they're sort of pointing to this task set, and they've learned that these shapes go with these actions. And this other color goes with another task set. And for experimental control purposes, we made it such that one task set, despite this one having 2 different contexts, it's not actually more frequent than the other one. So we present each of these contexts on only a quarter of trials, and this one on half the trials. So they're actually matched in terms of the frequency of how often those task sets are applied. But then we can ask, what happens if you start introducing new shapes? So that's the first transfer phase, like the diamond. And so whatever is correct for red in this task set and this diamond, if the model is learning this abstract structure that is sort of pointing to this latent task set, it should immediately transfer to gray. And so that's what's being shown here in the model. And this is true in both sort of the non-parametric Bayesian model that I introduced at the beginning and the neural network model. It shows faster learning even from the first trial in the context that had a shared task set compared to the other one. And you can see that humans also show that behavior. So they generalize, they learn faster when there's a task set that's shared across contexts, despite the fact that that task set is not more frequent than the other one, it's just more popular. And so we wanted to ask, does this relate to the kind of structured learning that we think? So we can look at prediction errors, and we're going to look at neural responses to prediction errors and see if they accord to the assumptions here. Prediction error is just the reward that you get minus the expectation. So just to give you a gist of how we're going to test this, let's say you get this new diamond stimulus in the orange context, and you press button 3. There are 4 buttons to press. And let's say you happen to get it correct. According to a standard reinforcement learning model, that would produce a positive reward prediction error because you didn't know which button was correct in advance. So you are sort of surprised by it. And then if you were to get that stimulus again and you press button 3 again, your prediction error should be smaller because you've learned to adjust your expectation, right? So that's just a standard idea from reinforcement learning. But now consider the case where you're getting the red diamond, and let's say in that case, button 1 is the correct one. Again, the very first time you get it, you should get a reward prediction error because you don't know that it's going to be rewarded. And then let's say right after that, or a few trials later, you get the gray diamond and you've never seen that before. If you're using a standard reinforcement learning model, you would have also just as big a reward prediction error because you've never seen the gray diamond before. Whereas if you're learning it in a structured way that's contextualized by task sets, then you would predict that the very first time you see the gray diamond and you get it correct, you actually would have a smaller reward prediction error if you already had seen that association for the red one. And so we're going to use that logic to look at EEG prediction error signals in EEG. We built a general linear model that looks across electrodes and time points and looks for signals of reward prediction error. Here, and she did find them. And here I'm just showing the beta coefficient of reward prediction error in a single electrode, FCZ, which is a mid-frontal electrode that has been shown to be sensitive to reward prediction errors in the past. And there's sort of 2 different time periods in which it's sensitive to the reward prediction error. And this is the scalp topography of it, but it's not important because we're not going to make any claims about what the underlying neural source of it is. All we want to know is, does the brain track reward prediction errors? And then within that region of interest in which you see prediction errors, is there additional signal due to structured prediction errors? And that's what Anne is showing here, is that in both the sort of regions of interest of the brain that are sensitive to reward prediction errors, there's an a unique effect of structural learning. So it seems like the brain is keeping track of the extent to which task sets are similar to each other and conditionalizing the expectations based on that. And so then we can ask, if the brain is doing that, does that actually predict the degree to which people are able to transfer to new contexts? And importantly, these prediction error signals are measured during the initial learning phase and during the first transfer phase, which allows us to test these structured prediction error signals. But we're going to use it to make predictions about how well people are able to transfer in a later transfer phase when we start adding in new contexts. And so even though I just show you the average effects of structured prediction errors, there are individual differences. So all these people with all these little black circles are individual people, and this is the beta coefficient showing the unique effect of structured learning prediction error. And so for the purposes of visualization here, I'm going to break it up into 2 groups, one in which people do have a positive significant effect of structured prediction error in their EEG signal. But then there's a group of people in blue who have, on average, no statistically significant effect of structured learning, even though they do have an intact representation of reward prediction error overall. And interestingly, when you then look at how likely they are to transfer in new contexts, so this is going to a new context where one of the previous task sets is repeated, and this is a new context in which they have to build a new task set altogether, you can see that there's a robust effect of transfer, which we had seen in previous experiments and is predicted by the model. whereas the people who don't have structure prediction errors in their EEG signal they show healthy normal learning, and they show normal learning in the initial phase, but they don't show that kind of transfer. What we also showed was that if you even look in the very first trial when they're in that new context, they're more likely, these people who showed these structure prediction error signals are more likely to try out the task set that was the most popular across contexts in the past compared to the less popular one, as predicted by this sort of clustering model. Okay, so a summary of that line of work is that doing this kind of transfer, structured learning affords transfer both within existing contexts and also to new contexts. It depends on clustering priors, and it informs neural representations of reward predictions. And a summary of that in the case of in the context of this sort of table is that I didn't show the initial learning data, but it turns out that if you are building this sort of structure where you know that TS1 is equal to TS2, there's actually no benefit of doing that during initial learning. And that's partly because the subject has no way of knowing, which dimensions of the stimuli point to the latent task set. Is it the C's? Is it the S's? Is there any structure at all? And in fact, it's inefficient to do that structured learning for just learning simple stimulus response mappings. If you were a deep neural network, you would learn it much more rapidly if you just learned conjunctive representations of C's and S's, and you would actually do quite well. But if you do notice that structure, it affords transfer of new informations of information within learned clusters, and also transfer of known rules to new contexts with a clustering prior. And it seems like people use that kind of architecture to perform their transfer learning, and the neural signatures of these hierarchical prediction errors do predict the degree to which they transfer in EEG, and there's also some fMRI evidence in other contexts. Okay, so that's all fine and nice, but if we want to ask this question about deeper forms of transfer, you might have a situation where, let's say you're a musician and you learn to play the piano, and then later you learn to play the guitar. And those on the surface are quite different in terms of what you have to do, what movements you have to make, but they do share some important information that we would hope people would be able to transfer. So for example, they share the chord progression. If you're trying to play a particular song, the desired sound or song might be similar across the piano and the guitar. And in reinforcement learning terms, you can think of that as like the reward function of what you're trying to achieve, what notes you're trying to produce. But they differ in how to do it, which movements you need to make. And on the flip side, you may learn to play the flute and then learn to play the saxophone, and perhaps you're learning to play different songs on those things, but you should be able to transfer some of the finger movements or the actual mappings or the transition function of which movements you make that take you to next states. So in this case, these things share the physical movements, mappings from sounds to notes. In this case, these different instruments share the chord progression. And you could also ask, which rhythm, if you wanted to play it in a compositional way, you might want to learn a particular song. And you may also want to ask, how fast should I play it or what tempo? And hopefully you would actually be able to transfer to new tempos altogether. So that's a challenge for trying to get an artificial system to be able to learn this compositional structure and to generalize it in a healthy way. So let's say you are that musician and you're then suddenly given a new instrument that you've never seen before, a piccolo. If you're a skilled musician and you've learned a lot of things, you should be able to realize that you can use the finger movements that you learned on a flute before to play a song that you've learned on the guitar. And so in order to do that, you need compositionality. You need the kind of compositionality that allows you to reuse the mappings that you played on a song that usually was played on the guitar. Essentially, you would want to combine these two different elements of the model. And if you want to think about that in terms of navigation, like I said, this isn't only applied to music. Perhaps you want to go to an ice cream shop, and perhaps you want to go somewhere that you've only driven to before, but you might want to take your bike. And so there are different routes that you would take on a bike to get somewhere than there would be on a car. There's all sorts of different movements that you would want to make, but you shouldn't have to learn from scratch how to get somewhere just because you're taking a different route to get there or a different set of mappings. So we're going to boil it down to this sort of more navigation style example in a sort of standard grid world setting. And so let's say, and for this part, I'm going to do this both for simulated agents and model-based reinforcement learning. So in this case, we're allowing the agent to plan over multiple steps, but also we're going to have humans try to solve these grid world tasks. And so we're just going to allow for rewards that could be anywhere in the grid, and they could be 0 or 1. And then we're going to give the agent the possibility of selecting multiple actions, but some of the actions will take the agent, let's say, left. Like in this case, A5 takes the agent left, and this one takes the agent right, and so forth. But in some grid worlds, these actions are the correct ones to move left, right, up, or down, and in other grid worlds, there may be other actions. And so this is going to set up the idea that there's different things to learn what to do, like what are the reward functions, where do you want to go? And sometimes, the top left might be the goal, sometimes the top right might be the goal, and so forth. And there's also different ways of moving around of how to do it, how to reach it. That's the transition function. So just again, to make the analogy to the guitar here is that if you take a couple of movements in this little grid world here, if you learned that there's a sort of set of actions that take you left, right, up, or down, that's analogous to playing a new guitar and playing a single note on a fret and then deciding, oh, now I should know the tuning of the guitar as a whole. So what Nick Franklin did when he started off on this problem is he noticed that what we had been doing before with task sets and with Adam Collins is akin to clustering knowledge in a joint way. Essentially, we're taking these contexts and saying, we're going to put them in the same bin if they point to the same task set, but that task set was sort of defining a function that determines the policy that incorporates both the transition function and the reward function. So you may be able to transfer if you go to a new context and both the transition function and the reward function are the same. But doing so will not allow an agent to generalize either of these functions independent of the other. In contrast, he built an independent clustering model that says you can just basically do the same thing. You can cluster with the same sort of non-parametric Chinese restaurant process according to popularity, but you can do so independently for contexts that are pointing to reward functions and for transition functions. And then you can sort of combine those together for performing new tasks. And so to test why that might be important, we set up this canonical task that's often used in reinforcement learning, also in the options setup that Mihaly mentioned before, called the rooms problem, although we're going to change it in a way that we call diabolical, just to show the need for this kind of generalization. And so what the agent has to do is has to navigate in a room, has to figure out what set of mappings it needs to use to move around across the little squares, and then it has to go to one of the doors. And if it goes to the right door, it'll take it to the next room. And when it goes to the next room, the mappings, the movements that it has to make to move it around may or may not be the same as what it's seen before. And also the door it has to go to get to the next room may or may not be the same. And so we'll have a whole series of rooms that it has to navigate. And if anything is repeating from one room to the next, if sometimes the mapping repeats or the correct door repeats, then the agent should be able to transfer that knowledge. But we make it diabolical in the sense that if the agent goes to the wrong door in any of the rooms, it has to go back to the start of the entire thing. So there's going to be a large cost of making mistakes. And so what Nick showed is that if you use the independent clustering model here, you can show the advantage of how many steps it takes to solve this problem. The flat model is just a control model that does no generalization at all. It just learns the model-based reinforcement learning in each new room as a whole from scratch. And then the joint clustering model can still show some advantages in transfer to the extent that sometimes the combination of mappings and room and door repeats, but the independent clustering model does quite a bit better. And that advantage grows with the number of rooms. So here I was just showing 3 rooms, but we did up to 40 rooms. And it also grows with the size of the grid world. So as you make the grid area bigger, the advantage grows for independent clustering over joint clustering. So there's a large cost in not transferring in the right way. And this is pointing out the need for compositionality in the sense that you learn abstractions that incorporate the reward function and cluster those separately from those that represent the transition function, such that you can compose new policies in new rooms in a way that's more efficient.
Small clarification. So
Yeah.
in this task, the context is only provided by the order of the rooms. So the subject needs to count, I'm in the second one now. So that is this given task set, or?
So yeah, when we run experiments like this in people, the contexts are usually we just use a different color of the room. So but
so it has a background color.
Yeah, and that
Okay.
background color may or may not be similar to other rooms that have similar mappings.
Okay.
But in the agents, we just tell it there's a new context. So it's like a standard agent might think that's an entirely new state altogether. But here it has to sort of factorize that and learn that it could try to reuse state action associations or models that it's seen in the past.
Yes.
But I also had a follow-up question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go for it.
Is this independent clustering in a similar spirit to how the successor representation kind of separates reward and transition structures into different components?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm going to talk about the successor representation a little bit in a bit, but so it does it's similar in that respect that it separates the reward function from the transition function, but it does so in a way that is in the service of clustering multiple of those things.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
But so similar in spirit in the sense that you can generalize differently from reward representations and from transitions, but not in the same way as you could generalize if those two things are combined together, right?
Yes, although as I'll say in the last part of the talk, the successor representation that does that, it's still kind of in order to really, all it really does is represent the probability that the agent's going to be in future states, and that's very conditional on the policy that it was. So it only can really transfer that if the policy in the new environment is similar to the policy that it had used in the past. Whereas in this setting, that's not the case.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
Okay.
Question
I mentioned that it could be useful to cluster things independently, but it's not always the case. There may be some environments in which there really is joint structure, that the transition function does get paired with the reward function repeatedly. And so to address that, initially what Nick did in this work is we built sort of a meta agent that just keeps track of a joint actor that clusters things jointly and an independent one. And it uses reinforcement learning to select based on the series of contexts that it's been in, whether the environment as a whole looks independent or joint. And so here would be an example of a setup where you have a couple of different contexts in which the goal is on the bottom left, and there's a particular mapping, and then there's other contexts that the goal is on the top right, and it's a different mapping. And these are all sort of jointly representing the goal, and the mapping would be useful. So in that case, the meta agent would learn over time that the joint actor is better at predicting behavior, and that you are able to transfer from one context to the next because the mapping function goes with the reward function and you can reuse it. But of course, you can set up other environments where things are completely independent of each other, that there's one goal and another goal, and each one of them is equally often associated with the different mappings. And in that case, the meta agent would learn to select the independent actor. In the original theoretical paper, Nick showed sort of theoretical advantages of having independent clustering over joint clustering, but it depended on certain statistics of the task. So here's just showing that we can have a meta agent that kind of learns that. And so we ran a human experiment where we gave him these different grid worlds, and we changed the statistics of how much it would be helpful to cluster things in a joint way or an independent way. And because I don't have time, I'm only going to show you this one summary slide, which showed that what I'm showing here is the similarity, the cosine between the predictions of an independent agent and the subject's behavior. And the experiment on the x-axis is manipulating whether it would be useful, whether the actual statistics of the world were independent, sort of ambiguous, both in independent and joint or joint. And basically the summary here from this paper, you can look at the details if you're curious, is that people look more joint in the way in which they transfer in new contexts if the previous set of contexts indicated joint structure, joint, that transition functions tended to go with reward functions, but they look more independent when the previous context looked more independent. So it seems like they're behaving a lot like the meta agent that I was just showing, that they are not just transferring, and they're not just doing it independently or jointly, but they're actually learning the structure of the environment and figuring out how to generalize. That's why we call it generalizing to generalize. All this work on compositionality was done using model-based reinforcement learning in the abstract way, but I wanted to just mention that, especially because we're using this musical theme in this talk, that a postdoc of mine, who's now a PI in Chile, Chris Calderon, built a recurrent neural network model that also tries to learn musical sequences. So in this case, it's trying to learn sets of notes to play in order and at the right time. And he calls this the ACDC model because it stands for Associative Cluster Dependent Chaining Model. And this is a model in which there's a recurrent neural network representing different sort of states of a sequence that the network has to learn, and then a sort of a basal ganglia module that sort of gates the transitions in the recurrent network from one state to the next. And the point of it was to ask, could we get it to learn sequences and transfer those sequences, but can we also get it to learn specific tempos, rhythms, and transfer those rhythms to sequences that it's learned in the past? And so one of my contributions to this paper, I guess I would say probably the most important contribution, was if I told Chris, if he's going to call this ACDC model, we should plug the outputs of the model to sound and have it learn to play a song by ACDC. So let's see if this actually will play. This is a YouTube video. So I don't know if you heard that, but that is the introduction to the song Thunderstruck by ACDC. I'll just play it again. And what this video is showing is just the dynamics of the recurrent neural network as it's switching between sort of one element in the sequence to the other. And the network can learn to do that. Okay, that's fine. It learns a particular sequence. But what he showed was that the same network, using these sort of principles of compositionality, could then be told to play that same song in a completely different tempo that it's never played it before, like play Thunderstruck in a bossa nova tempo, I think is. Yeah, so that's just a teaser for that paper, because of course there's a lot more details of the neural circuit, but the point is that having the ability of a neural network to represent things in a compositional way is going to be useful, and standard neural networks of sequence learning couldn't really do that. I also wanted to just very briefly say that in some ways our initial sort of noticing that there's like independent clustering or joint clustering, to be honest, it's a little bit kludgy to have a meta agent that does both, in the sense that it requires an entire agent to do a joint clustering and another agent to do independent clustering, and then another one sitting on top of that and figuring out which one to use. So in a recent paper by Rex Liu, a postdoc in my lab, he built a more general model based on a hierarchical Dirichlet process, which I also don't have time to go into, but it essentially gets the best of both worlds, where the model learns, a single model learns from scratch how much individual environments are joint or independent, but it also allows for exceptions. So instead of just saying, something is overall independent or so overall joint, you may be in an independent environment where there are exceptions of things with joint structure. And that was just published in Artificial Intelligence. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I just want to give you a gist of what kind of thing that could address. So just to go back to the Diabolical Rooms problem, for this we built an even more diabolical task we call the Hierarchical Diabolical Rooms problem, or a castle with dungeons. In this case, what the agent had to do was navigate a set of rooms, but in each room, instead of just going to a door, it would have to, in order to go to the next room, it actually had to go through a sequence of doors, let's say 1, 2, 3. And when it went to the first door, it would take it to a sub-level, which we think of as like, playing Super Mario Brothers on a video game, where you like solving the game and you go down and you have to solve another game to get back up. And in that sub-level, the mappings that it has to take may or may not be similar to what it had to take in the upper level. And then the door it has to go to in that sublevel in order to get back up may or may not be similar to that from the other sublevels. So it has to go through that sequence, and it has the ability to reuse structure, to reuse the combination of reward functions and transition functions, either independently or jointly. And it has to do that through a whole series of rooms. And again, anytime it makes a mistake at any level, goes to the wrong door at any level, it has to go to the back. And so Rex's model that learns this sort of covariance and independence of these model structures gets the best of both worlds and performs this task a lot faster than a model that just clusters independently, and certainly much faster than a flat model. Okay, so in the last part, I wanted to just focus on what I was already alluding to before about successor representations. And so far, what we've been talking about in terms of transfer is how an agent can transfer very specific transitions and goals, like movements or rewards. For example, like learning a C scale and transferring it to other guitars and to pianos. But real biological agents, we think, also transfer internalized abstractions. So things that are not just literal, but actual abstract representations that are going to be more general, easier to transfer. So as an example here, maybe you've learned to play specific notes on one guitar. You can transfer that to another. You can do so compositionally. But let's say you're learning on a fretboard how to play a guitar, and you're learning to play a particular scale. And now you're given another guitar, and the tuning may be different altogether. And the scale that you have to play is different. Like the order of the notes that you have to play is different. So now the reward function changes because you're rewarded for a different series of notes. And the transition function also changes. The sequence that you have to go through changes, and the tuning may change. Nevertheless, there's some abstraction that a guitarist should be able to learn, which is essentially that if you look at it here, that there are various parts of the fretboard that are all equivalent to each other in some abstract space. So these things that are highlighted as C's, those are all equivalent to each other. They're equivalent to each other regardless of what you're trying to do with them, regardless of the sequence that you're playing, and regardless of the rewards that you're getting. If you learn that equivalent structure, you're going to be faster at being able to play a new scale that you've never had to play before, even if the transitions change. That's the gist of it there. And while that sounds like a highly skilled thing for a guitarist to be able to do, I think this is actually the kind of thing that we do all the time. For example, in speech, when you're learning to speak to different people, you may be using different volumes, different pitches, different placements of your tongue, but you're learning the equivalence in an abstract space that doesn't require you to learn how to speak again every time. And so the question is, if this kind of structured learning is possible by corticostriatal circuits and reinforcement learning, how can you learn this kind of abstraction that results in essentially a compression of a high-dimensional state space into some more abstract form? And so this is work with Lucas Lehnert and Michael Littman, and we had this algorithm. Well, we're going to apply it to learning the guitar as well as some navigation tasks that I won't go into. And so the claim is that a guitarist internalizes how notes are mapped onto the fretboard and accelerates the learning of new sequences. So the question is, how can the R algorithm construct such internal representations? And this is joint work with Lucas and a grad student of mine, Alana Jasker, who's going to be testing this in humans. And the idea is that usually if you're building a neural network or a reinforcement learning model, what it's trying to do is just maximize reward. So it may, if you were to do this in a neural network setting, it may take some high dimensional state space and try to construct some internal representation that is a latent space that then allows it to predict what to do to get rewards. And when it gets feedback, just getting it correct will train the internal representation. That's usually what you're trying to do, is try to figure out how do you maximize rewards. And if you're going to compress information, you may do so in a way that is simply trying to maximize rewards. And arguably, that's what the deep neural networks that DeepMind uses to play Atari do. But what Lucas is going to propose is, rather than trying to compress in a way that maximizes reward, you want to compress in a way that still allows you to predict sequences of rewards. And it turns out that mathematically, this ends up being equivalent to using the successor features for representing rewards or for policies. But I'll just give you the gist of it here, which is that you're trying to predict, given your policy, given your actions that you're making, what is a sequence of rewards that you're going to observe, 0, 0, 0, 1, for example. And then you're going to use that to inform the latent space. And the question is, does that ability to be able to still predict sequences of rewards, does that help to construct an internal representation that transfers? So we're going to reuse the abstraction that is learned in this internal representation. That abstraction is essentially the equivalence of states, that like the different C notes are equivalent to each other. But we're going to throw away the details of exactly what the transitions and the rewards were in the task. All we're going to do is try to reuse the abstraction itself. So Lucas's thesis statement from his PhD was that learning an internal representation detailed enough to predict reward sequences is going to prevent overfitting to one task and allow accelerating learning across previously unseen tasks. So I just want to give you the gist of why this might be useful in a very simple problem before I go back to the guitar one. So let's say you have this grid world where there are a bunch of ones, a bunch of rewards on the right column, and you have to sort of navigate, move around in the grid world in order to get reward. Now, you can compress this representation, and if you notice that, all the rows are essentially equivalent to each other. And so in the original problem, if you're making these actions of going right, right, down, right, in the abstract problem, you could represent it this way, that you're going right, right, and that you're going down, but it's just taking you back to the same state that you're in before. If you compress this high dimensional state space into this one, you'll still be able to predict exactly the sequence of rewards that you get or the actions that you're making, but you're doing it in a much more abstract way. So the latent state sequence that you would observe would be, these are the action states that you would take, and then you would just say, here are the latent state sequences, and the actual row information in this world is thrown away. I guess I should just mention that if you're trying to do this in a reward maximizing way, if you're trying to just compress the world in a way that allows you to maximize reward, you could compress it all the way down to just a single state, which would be all you have to do is say, I'm in one state, and all I need to do is go right, and eventually I'm going to get reward. I won't be able to predict exactly the sequence of rewards that I'm going to get if I'm going up or down. But if I want to maximize rewards, I can just cluster it into one state. Whereas if you represent the things in a column way, or if you represent things that the rows are equivalent to each other, if you then go to another grid world in which columns also matter, even though the rewards may be in a completely different column and the actions that you have to take may be different, this kind of abstract representation will transfer. Okay, so that's the idea. And so he did the same thing with a guitar. And the way he did that is he represented the guitar fretboard as an MDP, where you have to take an action. And if you take one action that is consistent with a scale that the agent is trying to learn, it'll get rewarded only if it does the set of actions in the right way. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, anything else would give it a loss. Sorry, I'm going to just skip that and just cut to the chase here. And so what Lucas showed is that if you train an agent that's doing that on the initial problem of learning the scale, in orange is a reward maximizing algorithm. And that, in fact, is an algorithm that's using successor features to cluster the state space. So it's trying to figure out, how to reduce the problem in as much as it can in a way that still maximizes reward. And so for the initial learning of the sequence, there's no difference. But let's see if I can play this. What we did again is we took the output of the model and just said, what would it sound like if it played it? And this is going to be okay, so it's just playing the sequence that it was learning, and that's true for both the model that's doing reward maximizing and reward predictive. But then we give it a new scale to learn that has a different sequence, and that could be any sequence, but as long as it's learned that there's some equivalent structure along the fretboard, the reward predictive model can learn really quickly that new sequence, whereas the reward maximizing model is sort of constrained by the policy that it had used in the past, and it doesn't learn the right equivalent structure. So if you just, sorry. Trying to find the, there it is. Okay, so basically it's just waffling around and it's not able to learn the abstraction that allows it to transfer. And so I didn't really do justice to this work because I tried to summarize what is, I think, pretty great work that Lucas did in a very short amount of time. But if you're interested in it, you can check out the paper. This shows that this kind of reward predictive abstraction also works in navigation tasks to transfer in ways that just reusing successor features or maximizing rewards do not do. And so the very last part, I just wanted to mention that we think that perhaps this might be something that humans are doing or biological agents are doing, but we don't know yet. And one thing that was important in this work for it to work is that the way in which the agent builds the abstractions and notices the equivalent structure has to happen after it's explored the high dimensional state space in the first place. So you can't, there's a cost to compressing too quickly. Because if you try to say that two things are equivalent to each other before you've explored the full state space, you can sort of trick yourself into a very suboptimal structure. And so in that algorithm that's doing that compression, it does it after first exploring the high dimensional state space, then it compresses, and then it can reuse that in new environments. So that motivated the idea that perhaps replay offline is when an agent might be actually doing this clustering. So rather than replaying being used only for training previously learned memories or model-based agent training, model-free learning, the idea here is that perhaps what replay is doing is allowing an agent to replay settings that were similar in a reward predictive state space in temporal proximity to each other, even if they had not been experienced in temporal proximity to each other, that supports abstraction that would facilitate transfer. So basically, the gist of it here is that you may learn a reward predictive sequence. You might bind that to some like hippocampal memory representation of state action, state associations. And then during sleep, you may reactivate the reward predictive network. And then that would then trigger activation of all the corresponding high dimensional state space that are similar to each other, which then would get abstracted in the cortex in a compressed way. That's just an idea at this point that we're about to test. Okay, so a summary of all this is that we think these sort of hierarchical prefrontal basal ganglia interactions support structure learning across levels. And we saw that if you have these hierarchical interactions in neural networks, those were actually slower to acquire action contingencies compared to just a flat network that just learns things in a conjunctive way. But that if you have that hierarchical structure, it affords generalization and transfer, and it seems like that's what humans are doing. And there's a role in development. We see that even babies that are 8 months old seem to be doing this hierarchical kinds of transfer. But then I moved on to talking about this question of learning to learn, like how do you learn in new environments, how to reuse structure in a way that also allows you to support compositionality. And then finally, I talked about state abstractions for sort of deeper kinds of transfer, proposing just for now, speculatively, that there may be a role of replay. Okay, with that, I want to thank all of the people who actually did this work. So Lucas Lehnert on the reward predictive abstractions, Rex Liu on that hierarchical Dirichlet process model that is the generalization of Nick Franklin's model, and Collins on all the work on task sets and the EEG aspects of structure learning, and Alana, who's working on these state abstractions in replay and in humans. And thank you for your attention.